webinar, Ann Petrick. Ann.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Ann Petrick, Senior Director of Research at Vistage Worldwide. I'm happy to host this latest webinar in our Peak Performer webinar series. This series is designed to support your leadership climb by bringing the most trusted experts to the Vistage community. Experts who provide exceptional insight and best practices, helping you navigate new challenges and possibilities. Now, our latest CEO Confidence Index survey is in the field right now and is showing that since the beginning of the year, 1 in 4 businesses have seen their retention rates decrease. 62% indicate they're having challenges operating their businesses due to not being able to find workers. So in response, 56% of CEOs report they are boosting wages, 23% are offering hiring bonuses. So to help you think about your compensation plans to remain competitive, today's focus is performance incentives that drive employee engagement. We've invited Peggy Richmond, the Director of Compensation Services at Insperity, and Sherry Fields, a performance specialist with the Service Operations team at Insperity. They're going to step us through incentive plan best practices, questions CEOs and business owners should be asking themselves, and trends and methods for proactive engagement. So Sherry, let's turn it over to you.
Okay, well, good morning. Well, thank you very much. Nice to meet everyone. Nice to see you in this digital realm. So before we get started, I even have a few housekeeping items to talk about. Just want to let you know that it's important to know that any of the information that Peggy and I are going to be sharing with you today is for informational purposes only. So Insperity doesn't really provide legal, tax, or financial advice. So you shouldn't rely solely upon this general discussion about best practices to address any specific circumstance in your business. All right, let's move on to the fun part. So how do I stay competitive so not to lose people? Well, motivation comes by 2 forms, extrinsic and intrinsic values. You know, money is an example of extrinsic. You know, we all like that paycheck, right? Intrinsic is something that you can select. Intrinsic motivation is the act of doing something without any obvious external rewards. You do it because it's just enjoyable and interesting to you, rather than because of an outside incentive or pressure to do it, you know, such as a reward or a deadline. What are your employees' intrinsic values? As their leader, you should know this. Is your employee competitive? If this is someone that's highly driven, like a go-getter, you're hiring for intrinsic motivation, and money is just a small piece to that puzzle. So really, the key is to figure out on an individual basis what motivates that individual. Culture design does drive engagement. So what kind of culture are you building that's attracting and especially retaining those employees that Ann was just talking about, those retention efforts? You have a culture, and it's either by default or by design. You might have heard that. Culture does drive structure and practices, which drives organizational climate, and that has a direct correlation to the collective attitudes and behaviors of the employees. You know, for example, me, Cherie, I'm engaged at a certain level, but my coworker, Jason, for example, he's motivated also, but it just looks different at that individual level. Collectively, though, it's our culture. There's also something else to consider, the psychological contract. It's a concept developed in contemporary research by organizational scholar Denise Rousseau, and it represents mutual benefits, perceptions, and informal obligations between an employer and an employee. So they're an unwritten set of expectations from the employment relationship, and it develops and evolves constantly based on communication or lack of between the employer and employee. And okay, this is even true like with the sandwich artists at Subway. So they have a psychological contract with their employer, right? They expect that one free 6-inch Jared-approved sub meal from their employer. And if you take away their 6-inch sub, they might leave the company. The employer might not have even known that taking away their free 6-inch sub from that sandwich artist would cause them to leave, but they did. So what happened? Well, there was a breach in that psychological contract. Now, the higher levels of work engagement, the more wiggle room and leeway you might have with that psychological contract. And if you have highly engaged sandwich artists and you take away their 6-inch sub, their free one, they might not leave. But lower levels, any breach in their psychological contract could cause them to leave. So how are your managers rewarding behaviors? Are your managers setting expectations, following up with consequences or incentives? Are they asking the employees what skills they need to do their job, what tools they need? Are they finding out what barriers that the employee might have as the manager? They need to find out ways to help them remove the barriers so that the employee can perform their job better. And also, how do they reward behaviors when they're successful? Do they celebrate company and individual successes? One of the biggest key factors is feedback. How are employees receiving feedback? There are numerous research that has been shown that employees want more feedback. They want to hear from their managers and their leaders. Feedback is really, it has like 3 components to it to make it really effective. It needs to be balanced, the positive along with the areas for development. And it needs to be really specific. Instead of just, hey, Joe, you did a great job today. It's, hey, Joe, when you, picked up the piece of paper on the floor today and showed one of our company goals and, of everyone taking care of the property, that was a really great job that you did. That's really specific, right? And timely. You don't want to wait too long. It's better when it's fresh. This should be part of your performance review cycle, and it should be ongoing. So there is a direct correlation between the work engagement and the job performance. The job performance is broken down in how an employee performs their task, that company citizenship behaviors. And it's more than just performing your task, it's how you're performing in your company and how you help the company obtain their goals or business results. All right, Peggy, well, I think we're ready for the next slide. All right, how to plan incentives based on the individual, department, and full company performance without it becoming too complicated. How about having those conversations? There's a language of appreciation. Some people just prefer private reward. Some like public acknowledgement, shout it from the mountaintops, the more that know, the better for them. Some prefer a monetary gift, and others might just prefer quality time. So having those individual conversations is going to help uncover that information. You should be having those conversations during regularly scheduled one-on-one meetings. That's going to help uncover what that psychological contract stipulations are that you may or may not have known about, right? What's driving that employee to stay, the things that aren't being said. But you can find out by asking, like what are their development goals? And how can you as a manager help those individuals get to that goal? One of my coworkers, Jason, shared a great story with our manager, Ellie. She gave him dinner without even asking him. She just observed that he had worked really hard and she knew what would motivate him. She knew he liked pizza, so she sent him pizza. Man, that spoke volumes to him. It went a long way. There are 2 sets of values, both the unpublished, the things that are known and then not talked about, and then the published values. Both sets of values can help drive your culture. It definitely determines your culture. So the underlining assumed values of Insperity is to take care of your people. And that drove the culture down to the idea of rewards and compensation. And that's why Ellie, our manager, bought Jason dinner. So their goals should align with the company mission, vision, and values. You need to be able to observe and assess and recognize those behaviors. And going back to values, culture drives and final collective of attitude and behaviors. The next step is retention, and final step is organizational performance. If you retain the talent you want to retain collectively, the overall collective performance improves. Your organizational performance will decline if you lose your high performers. So research has found that there are 3 types of commitment: effective, commitment, continuous commitment, and normative commitment. Effective is you stay with the company because, hey, you just want to. Continuance is you stay because you need to. You know, compensation does fall into this category. So if you're not compensated well, you no longer need to stay. You lose your continuance commitment. But the normative commitment is you stay because you're supposed to. It's to, you know, the normal to do so. It's the trend, the feelings of belief that they don't leave because it's such a great company. Like here at Insperity, I've heard hundreds of times, hey, I'm not leaving, you know. It's just not normal to leave Insperity. It is part of our culture. So if your culture is to instill a normative commitment, that's big. So, you know, as we've seen from these points, there's so much more to total compensation than just a salary. There are so many pieces to incentives and compensation, and it does start with culture. So the number one rule, simply care about your people, your greatest asset. And our co-founder of Insperity, Paul Servati, he wrote a book, it's called Take Care of Your People, and it's the golden rule for retention. All right, Peggy, why don't you talk to us about goals of compensation?
Great, thank you, Cherie. So let's shift
You're welcome.
gears and talk about compensation. First, some basics. The goals of compensation are straightforward. You want to attract and retain individuals and motivate them financially to succeed within your company. The program should motivate your employees to perform better and more efficiently, but you need to take into consideration affordability concerns before you know, because you need to know how costly your compensation programs are. If your programs aren't developed responsibly, an organization could incur labor costs that exceed what they can afford to pay. And it also goes without saying that all your programs need to be legally compliant. Ultimately, compensation deals with establishing a meaningful relationship between work and rewards. This drives employee engagement. Instead of thinking about compensation as a separate component of your HR strategy, I really urge you to consider how your comp impacts your overall company goals. So I think we all know there are two types of cash compensation, base and variable pay. So base pay is your annual salary or your hourly wage that you pay employees for doing their jobs. Base pay is pretty straightforward, whereas variable pay is where we see it taking on many forms. A bonus is usually the most popular form of variable pay. So for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to focus on variable pay and how it can be used to motivate employees and drive engagement. So as I mentioned, variable pay is any compensation that an employee receives in excess of their base salary. There's several reasons for incorporating base pay into your pay plans, but most of them have to do with aligning employee goals to the goals of the company. So done well, variable pay can align performance with identified objectives. It can create a culture that rewards and recognizes employees. It can help you maintain competitiveness in the market, and it also can help you link your rewards to your organizational successes. Done well, variable pay can also control costs, increase motivation, boost productivity, and make employees feel more valued and encourage them to meet or exceed expectations. So that all sounds great, right? So maybe you have an incentive plan and you're questioning if it's working. Maybe you're just at the point that you're thinking about implementing a plan. No matter what stage you're in that process, I do have some things for you to think about as you begin to develop your plan. The first thing to consider is, does the criteria reflect an important company priority or strategy? Most people, think this makes intuitive sense. Why would you create a plan around something that's not a priority in your company? But it's often really surprising, especially with plans that have been around a while, how items end up in a plan or stay in a plan that really are no longer company priorities. Second of all, can it be measured? And will that measurement lead to improvement? This is often a difficult question. For example, if your goal is customer satisfaction, you need to clearly think about how you're going to measure how satisfied your customers are. Does the criteria reflect the stakeholders' needs? And by this, I mean all stakeholders, employees, customers, management. If the goal, for example, is to increase customer satisfaction, but you don't have a measure in the plan to measure customer satisfaction, it's likely that the plan will not accomplish those goals. I once had a manager that said, you can tell people every day to turn right, but if they're paid to turn left, they're going to turn left every time. Can it be communicated and understood? So let's go back to that customer satisfaction example. Instead of telling employees that the plan is going to be based on customer satisfaction, you need to identify an objective measure to collect that data. So maybe you will have a survey and you will send that out to a number of customers, and based on what they say, you'll determine employee payouts. Really something objective and measurable needs to be used. Which ties into number 5, who will collect the data? I've seen plans fail because it wasn't clearly laid out in the beginning who was collecting what data. And it's also very important to have a timeline in place. For example, if you're going to do a quarterly plan, but you know you don't get results back until 2 months after the quarter closes, really think about what impact that is going to have on the plan administration and tying it back to the performance of the employees. And finally, will the criteria be sustainable? So this doesn't mean that the measures have to be exactly the same every year. In our customer satisfaction example, maybe you start out with a baseline lower, we want X number of employees or of customers to indicate they're very satisfied. And then maybe the following year you raise that goal. So that's absolutely acceptable, but I would steer you away from radically changing the plan every year because you can give employees whiplash with that. So as you continue, so you've answered all these questions, you feel like, yes, I'm ready. I think an incentive plan is the right thing for me. I've got some of these things in place. Let's talk about some best practices. So one of the first questions when we work with clients we often get is, how many elements do I include in my incentive plan? Insperity recommends no more than 4. Really consider what you're trying to achieve and go from there. As I said, employees are smart. If you include too many elements in your plan, they may end up driving towards one of those elements that really isn't the most crucial. And I'll give you an example of that. I once saw a plan where the designer included attendance as a measure. And, obviously attendance is important. You want your employees to come to work. But the other goals that they had set in the plan made it unlikely that anyone would reach those goals if they weren't coming to work. But unfortunately, they weighted attendance so heavily that at the end of the cycle, they realized they were just paying people a bonus to come to work, which was not the goal. So what we did with that is we changed attendance to an eligibility requirement. I think we said, you can have no more than 1 no call, no show in this period in order to be bonus eligible. And it worked a lot better the following cycle. Ensure you have the means to collect the data. So we talked about who is going to be collecting the data and when, but don't forget to think about the how. Nothing will create disruption in your plan faster than having employees who don't believe the data, who don't trust it, or who find errors in it. Another important characteristic that we haven't discussed is ensuring that the goals aren't attainable, but that each individual has some influence over achievement. It's fine if you want to include a broad company measure in an incentive plan like profitability, I see that a lot. The company must achieve a profit of X in order for the plan to pay. That's fine. That makes financial sense. But I wouldn't advise making that a huge part of an incentive plan for somebody that has very little influence over company profits as a whole. That can be very demotivating for employees. I mean, either, well, the company's not doing well, even though I don't have anything to do with it, I'm not getting my bonus, or yeah, the company's great and I don't have to do anything and I'm still going to get it. I would really encourage you to tie it more to something that they can control. Maybe they have some profitability in their department. Maybe they do something in their day-to-day that impacts overall profitability. So I think that's an important thing to think about. Remember, if you are going to put one of those broad measures in your plan, you really need to be updating everyone on how the company is doing. You don't want surprises at the end of the cycle. A good incentive plan, as I said, should not be a surprise at payout time. Employees need to clearly understand what's expected of them and what type of performance elicits what type of payout. I often recommend, when working with clients, really showing a specific example of what high, average, and low performance look like, and then tying that to what the reward would be. You perform like this, this should be your expected reward. Ensure you're challenging your employees, but don't be afraid to readjust. In 2020, we saw lots of clients needing to step back and reassess the plans that they had put in place at the beginning of the year. That's absolutely fine, because you want to continue to keep your employees motivated, especially when you have a year like we did last year. And finally, show a link between incentive pay to the individual, group, and organizational goals, really in order to help them stay motivated and understand how they are part of a larger picture. As you're hearing, variable pay can get very complicated very quickly. So it's good to follow a few simple best practices when you're developing your plan. First of all, try your hardest to keep it simple. Don't add too many performance measures. You want employees to understand what they need to do and how they will earn their payout. That goes hand in hand with communications. Always share your new plans and any changes to the plans with your stakeholders, ideally before the measurement period begins. Hey, next month we're going to be rolling out this plan. I know that sometimes mid-year changes are inevitable, but ideally employees should understand what the plan, how it works before the cycle begins. You don't want it to come as a surprise to them. I also recommend management taking time throughout the year to review the progress on the performance and make any adjustments as needed. This really should be an interactive process where you sit down with employees, talk through, this is how we're doing, this is what I see, in order to keep those lines of communications open. I know that this can be challenging, especially when there's a million things going on, to take the time to have those conversations. But having that conversation and keeping the lines of communication open is really a key to success. And finally, evaluate the plan throughout the year. I recommend doing a full stakeholder review. Put those checkpoints in place and do them, because if you think about it, every stakeholder is going to have a slightly different thing that they are interested in. So think your CEOs are really going to want to know, is this plan aligned to our company goals? We put this thing in place in order to increase company satisfaction. Is that happening? Your CFO is going to want to know about affordability. Where are we trending? How much is this going to cost? What are the payouts looking like? Obviously, it's important to consult with tax advisors. When you pay out and how you pay out does have some tax implications and timing. HR, communication professionals that hopefully have helped you communicate the plan, as well as payroll, so that they have are expecting the file. When is the file coming? How is it going to be paid? All of those folks should be included in those checkpoints to ensure you don't have surprises at the end. So one of the first things that my team does at Insperity, when we have a client looking for help on an incentive plan, is to take a look at market data. And this is some very broad data from World at Work's 2020 salary budget survey. But in Insperity, we do have the ability to pull bonus data or incentive data on the specific job, in the specific location, by industry. So this is much broader than typically we would look at, but I wanted to give you an idea about how important it is to really understand what the market is doing. On this, you'll see variable pay data for the last several years. We've got kind of what was budgeted and then what actually ended up being paid out. So you'll see 2020 had some differences. We all know that there were some challenges in 2020 with the average pay being lower than as expected. 2021 is looking better, but right now it really remains to be seen what those final payouts are going to be. And just a note on this data, this is averages. So by no means am I saying, you know, every single person in one of these job categories receive this amount. So in conclusion, incentive pay is one of many ways to motivate your employees. It is not right for every company, and it's not right for every job. Most of the designing work happens in the very beginning of the plan. I know, you know, everybody kind of always wants to jump to the, okay, let's go tell employees, but really it takes a lot of planning and a lot of forethought before you reach that step. You really need to think about who's going to be included, what are you going to be measuring, who's going to measure it, how are we going to communicate it, when are we going to pay it, all of those things before rolling out a plan. A good plan will clearly define what employees need to do and provide them enough motivation to do it. It should be a win-win for the company and the employee. Every plan is different, and one size definitely does not fit all when it comes to incentive plans. If you have any specific questions for Cherie or I on anything that you've heard or would like to have a deeper discussion, please feel free to reach out to us at the email box below, and we will be happy to talk with you about the services that Insperity provides or any advice or help that we can offer to you specifically. So with that, I will turn it back over to you, Anne, to talk to let us know what questions we may have.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, ladies. That was very insightful and a lot of questions that we've received. And I want to talk first, Cherie. You talked about understanding the motivators of, and then specifically in one-on-ones, understanding everyone's motivations. We've had a lot of questions about entry-level workers. And I know that Peggy shared that, you know, having incentives that are tied to something they can control. So how do you understand the motivators of entry-level workers to determine which plans will have the most impact on their actual daily behavior? Because so much is talked about for managers or professional positions, but not much is talked about for those entry-level employees.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I can give you 5 tips for that. So, and this applies to whether they are entry-level or higher, but definitely this is applicable. And what you're looking for are things that are going to help drive those behaviors that get to commitment and then the engagement, right? We're talking about engagement today. So number 1 is help them understand their jobs and how they fit into the overall company goals. You know, you have to help make that connection for them. And then giving them some realistic deadlines and milestones for achieving goals and projects. And third, give employees authority and means to get the job done by outlining very clear expectations. And again, remember we talked about this already, providing that timely feedback be their coach and that inspiring leader, not their micromanager. Fourth, acknowledge good work and celebrate individual and company successes with your employees. And then last, help them develop a very clear development plan for advancement or learning new skills if they don't want to leave that job. Not everybody likes to leave their position. Make sure you give them an opportunity to use what they've learned.
Okay, fantastic. And Peggy, I know you talked about how long is it going to take to get the data. What is the recommended cadence? Is a quarter actually too long in today's market to be able to have the, the metrics and the incentives laid out?
That is an excellent question. And comp theory tells us that lower level transactional workers really prefer to see those rewards and they're most effective as close to when the action is performed as you can. That being said, you also need to think about your kind of population, how things are reported, how you budget, as well as what you're trying to achieve. So let me give you an example. I have worked with and seen monthly plans before where kind of everybody was churning every month. Here's how you did, here's what you got. Okay, let's move on to the next month. In some respects, those plans are great because they are that immediate feedback. Where that causes challenges, though, is if you have a retention problem, right? So if you have folks that you're seeing a lot of turnover, lengthening out that cycle can really be helpful, because then you get a mindset of, instead of, oh, I'm going to get my bonus check this month, and go, well, actually my bonus check won't be coming for another 2.5 months. Maybe I should think about leaving a little bit more. So I guess my answer would be there is no magic bullet. There's no right or wrong. It's really think about your particular roles, what you're trying to achieve with that plan, and then put in what works best for you.
Okay, so that's fascinating, putting that carrot further out to drive that retention. Very interesting. All right, Cherie, back to you. We talked a little bit about the extrinsic and intrinsic motivation, and I'm fascinated by the idea of a psychological contract. And you talked about the breach in the psychological contract. So I'm thinking about during the pandemic, what about the flexibility and remote work that many companies offered during the pandemic? Has that become a new psychological contract on the part of the employee?
Yeah, I would say that is definitely becoming more and more at the forefront. And one of those intrinsic motivations, if you would, or part of the psychological contract, in any of those intrinsic or psychological contract, those things reside in the mind of the employee. And so really, there isn't any way for you to find out or dig in or get to the bottom of what that is unless you just have those conversations with them. And there are some really great explorative type questions that you can ask, like, what attracted you to this organization? And then they may divulge to you why they want that 6-inch sub, right, that we talked about, or remote working is really important to me. That is definitely one of the big contributing factors to employee retention that we have seen recently. You could also ask them, hey, do you feel like you're doing your best work here, and why or why not? You're going to really start to uncover a lot of things that you may not have known. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? We've probably all heard that one. But what about this follow-up? Like, how can we help you get there? So some of those open-ended questions can really dig into what is part of that psychological contract. So yeah, that was a great question, and great that it was connected with the pandemic, because that is new to our culture and to an ongoing, I think, issue that we're going to continue to see.
Yeah, certainly. We're seeing that in some of our data as well. A lot of CEOs struggling with that hybrid model.
Yep,
all right, Peggy.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Peggy, coming back to you, going back to the 2 types of cash compensation that you talked about, can you clarify the difference between a pay increase and a bonus, and how can they be used interchangeably?
Well, if you think about it, really a pay increase to the base pay You get your base pay for doing your job, right? That's kind of the agreement. I come to work every day, I perform based on my job description, I get this amount. And we do, many companies do merit increases where they give additional funds, maybe annually based on how an employee performs. Maybe you give a cost of living every year to keep up with that. But that's really the overall intention of base pay. Variable pay is really for something extra outside of that kind of day-to-day work. Usually it has a finite term, so an annual bonus, a semi-annual bonus, where we as a company are going to drive toward this set of goals this year. Now we're going to lay out what you as an individual employee needs to do in order to help us with that. And then we would see the payout on that one. So variable pay and variable pay and base pay typically are not used interchangeably.
Okay.
That being said, we just finished 2020, right? So we saw a number of our clients getting creative and kind of going, I'm not sure that I want to give base pay this year and build everything into my fixed costs. So let me relook at my bonus and see if maybe I have the opportunity to swizzle a bit. And those plans are working perfectly fine, provided that it's communicated appropriately. Okay, we're not going to do the COLA this year, but instead, here's what you can drive towards. So kind of, I would have answered that question very differently 5 years ago, probably, than I did today because of the creativity that we're seeing in the market.
Great. Well, and this might apply to a more regular circumstance, but how do you avoid the problem where bonuses or incentives or any maybe profit sharing becomes expected rather than over and above incentives?
That is honestly something that I get asked all the time. Last year we saw, and I will say we saw an uptick in these because we had a lot of clients who kind of, we've always paid this and it's been fine, we can afford it. And then last year came and they went, wait a minute, what am I buying with this? Because if you think about it, it really is a contract and that you really should be buying something with your bonus dollars. So we did a lot of work with clients over the past 6 months to really write down, to standardize, and to formulate what the bonus is, right? This is the plan. This is what you need to do. This is how much you're going to get, and worked with them to communicate that to their employees. I mean, it's not, if you have somebody that's not performing, it may not be an easy conversation, but at the same time, think about that employee that is going above and beyond. And the fact that they're going, well, this guy got the same bonus as me and I'm, doing all this and they're not, right? So by not doing anything, it doesn't make it any easier. It's just kind of which problem do you want to choose?
Okay, excellent. When you're doing those incentive plans, if someone's changing their incentive plan every year, does that motivate or demotivate employees if it changes annually?
I personally would recommend not radically changing every year. You can absolutely, if using our customer satisfaction example, our customer satisfaction is great. We don't need to keep rewarding on this. Let's put something else in there. Absolutely, you should do that. But radical changes every year, I have seen organizations, I think I probably used the term whiplash, right? Well, this year I was supposed to do this, and now you're telling me to do this. And people end up confused and maybe not even sure what they should be driving towards or why. So I would say absolutely look at your plans every year. Absolutely, multiple times a year. Absolutely think about that. But really consider the impact on the average employee and don't do a radical change 3 years in a row, for example. It's just going to be too much.
Okay. Great. So Sheree, we'll go back to you. How can you engage an employee to actually set a goal in those conversations you're recommending when they say their goal is to get a paycheck and go home?
Yeah, well, okay, so we can't have 100%. We're just not going to reach 100% anyway. That would be our goal, though, but it definitely goes back to having those conversations and having an understanding of how to set clear expectations. When I'm working with my clients, I hear all the time, "Oh yeah, I'm having one-on-one meetings with my employees." Oh, that's great. Okay, well, tell me a little bit about that. And it turns out that they're just talking about tasks. It's like check, check, check. They don't dive in and have those conversations about development and about reaching goals and about the shared goal with the organization and discussing what is your dream job and what is it that I could be working with you on to reach that goal. So I think again that it comes back to having those conversations. You just cannot give them enough feedback because they ask for more, and also they enjoy that time with you. They build those relationships. They start building trust, and then that's when they'll start opening up and sharing or divulging things that maybe they wouldn't have.
Okay, interesting. So that, very qualitative, relationship based. Would you ever recommend doing a survey of your employees to understand different perspectives, like on their intrinsic rewards or something like that? Something that's more anonymous? Well, not anonymous, but automated.
We do. We offer surveys for engagement, culture, and climate surveys here at Insperity with all of our clients. And so part of that aspect is when we get the results back, we meet as a team and we collaborate on what are some things that we can help we here at Insperity, and then what is it that the client would be responsible for. And so a lot of that could come out or show up from one of those surveys. Another thing is focus groups. I was doing some work with a client and they said, "Oh yeah, we've got a baseball team and we have Taco Tuesdays and our employees just love it." Well, when we went in and did focus groups with them, they said, "Yeah, we can't stand that Taco Tuesday. The president shows up and we feel obligated to be there and we feel like a heel if we don't show up. We hate it." Well, they didn't know. They thought they loved it. So. Yeah. So focus groups is another way along with surveys that we could really uncover some of those things that they might not feel comfortable talking about.
Interesting. Okay, so I'm going to put this question out and both of you can and share, but is there any guidance you have in designing incentive plans for salespeople specifically that might be different than the best practices that you shared?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Sales comp, sales plans are a whole nother ball game. And we definitely work with a lot of clients and do a lot of sales plans for our clients. I think a lot of times the most difficult thing about a sales comp plan is really, once again, comes in the planning stage, comes before you actually are ready to roll it out, right? You really need to think about your sales cycle. How long is that sales cycle? Because that absolutely will tie to how often you're paying your folks, right? You need to think about what profitability you need. How much are you going to give and for each sale, or are you going to give them a quota and tell them they have to sell this many or this amount? What about overachievement? Are you comfortable with unlimited overachievement? Do you want to cap that? Same with underachievement. And so, as I said, we have a lot of resources for our sales comp folks, and we work a lot with that. But usually, once again, every plan is unique. Every plan is different. There are best practices, but there's not necessarily a right or wrong way to do it. That would be my feedback.
Okay, excellent. All right, a couple more questions for you, Peggy, then we'll go back to you, Sherry, before we wrap it up. Is a bonus the same thing as profit sharing? What's the difference between those two things, Peggy?
That is I get that question a lot. And really, I think in the kind of commonly, we see those terms used interchangeably. But really kind of the textbook difference between the two is a profit sharing plan. You have to have profit in order to pay out, right? So as a company, you say, we are going to achieve profits of X%. And once we get there, X% over that, we're going to distribute amongst our employees, right? A bonus, using our customer satisfaction example, it may have nothing to do with profitability directly. Indirectly, obviously, you want to have satisfied customers. But those are really the main differences is that profitability component, and something that we see a lot.
Okay, I think I know the answer to this based on all of your questions, but should managers have any kind of discretion in what bonuses their employees get, or it sounds like that's part of a set plan that's communicated?
I think there should, personally, I think there should be some manager discretion. But kind of what I see when we talk about maybe your 2 to 4 items that you're going to have in the plan, maybe one of those is individual objectives, and the manager should, to your point, set clear objectives for their employees. So yes, I do think managers should have some say. I am not personally a fan of the plans that just kind of give managers a bucket of money and say, here, go distribute it, just because I think there is the possibility for issues with equity, diversity, things like that. So I am a fan of putting more parameters on it, because you don't want any charges that you're treating people unfairly, even though that may not at all be the case. On the surface, sometimes those claims could appear that way.
Okay, great. A few more questions. Thank you so much. Back to you, Sherry. You talked about the surveys, and how can you assure employees that the surveys are actually anonymous? Some might not actually believe that, even if you tell them they won't be identified.
Communication. That's where that transparency and building trust comes in, beforehand. So employees want to trust, they want to be trusted, they want to be able to trust you. All of us do, right? And so if you have that rapport or that trust with them, then when you're communicating how this is going to be laid out, then they will trust that and believe what you say, that it is anonymous. I can tell you from Insperity, it is completely anonymous when we do our surveys. We have clients that say, hey, I want to know who said that. We don't have any way, because it's through a third party. So as long as that's communicated and make sure that they understand, again, clarify, because what I say sometimes is not always what you hear. So that's why I say communicate, say it again, and tell them again. An adult learner needs to hear it 7 to 10 times before they remember or believe something. So so I would say that the communication aspect up front is, and how you play that out and how you set that up will be how successful it is or received.
Okay, great. All right, so just going back to the process then of setting up a variable plan, what does it take to get started? Where do you start? Do you start with a survey, or where do you start internally if you're thinking about creating that variable incentive program?
I'm assuming that question is for me. With our clients, usually, as I said, the first thing we do is we go to the data, right? We have multiple databases that we subscribe to, and we want to pull that external third-party data. It's not set in stone that it has to be that way, but it usually gives us a good indicator of kind of what the market is doing, what would make sense for this particular job. So that's kind of step one. And then really we spend a lot of time with our clients talking through many of the questions that I went through here. What are you trying to do? How much can you afford? Who are you going to include? A lot of those things that they haven't thought about in terms of what if somebody hires mid-year? What if somebody turns? What if you have a poor performer? So kind of all of that stuff. And we work together in kind of coming up with those answers to all of those questions. And then we do help them document the plan for sharing with their employees. So.
Great. And about how long does that take from start to finish to launching a plan?
It really depends on the level of client engagement. And we can, I've seen them done in a week with a super engaged client that kind of had all the answers and knew exactly what they wanted. But a lot of times, I'm thinking about one of the ones that I worked on not too long ago. I was talking with the HR person, which is fine and totally normal, but she kind of was like, I need to go talk to finance about that. I need to go talk to the CEO. And the CEO actually ended up kind of pulling together a round table, having all of his leaders talk about some of these things, because these are important decisions and they shouldn't be made lightly. And so if, when they contact us, I guess they're not as far along in that process. Sometimes it takes longer for them to really kind of think through all of the things that they need to think through. And we help them with asking those right questions and all of that.
Okay, one last question. Not sure who could best answer this, but with seeing hiring bonuses or referral bonuses being something that a lot of small mid-sized businesses are using in challenges hiring, are there any best practices? Do they get them at the point of the bonus? Or I love the idea of stretching that out over a quarter. Like if you reach 90 days, what are some best practices in hiring bonuses?
I agree. I think I saw, somebody told me the other day, they saw a local fast food place had a hiring bonus. And that makes it tough for, what is a couple of years ago was seen as a really big perk. Now it's kind of everybody's doing it and it's expected. So absolutely, I would recommend making sure that whatever you're buying with that bonus, you're actually getting. I have seen companies that give it the first day and then they make the employees sign it saying, oh, well, if I quit within X amount of time, I have to pay it back. But I mean, I always encourage my clients to really think about that. Honestly, what if the employee refuses to pay it back? Are you going to go after it? That to me is much more risky than maybe giving a portion of the bonus when they first sign on, and then a portion at 90 days, a month, kind of whatever makes sense for your particular organization. I would definitely also put some caveats in place around, they have to be performing at standards. You don't want somebody who's on their second warning out the door. You don't want to have to pay them a bonus kind of thing.
Yeah, gotcha. All right. Well, ladies, thank you so much for sharing your insights, Peggy and Cherie, as part of our Peak Performer series. And we'll be sending out a link to the recording as well as the slides within 24 hours. And we'll also include a link to register for next Friday's webinar with Vistage Chief Research Officer Joe Galvin and Dr. Gleb Tapersky on Talent Wars 2.0 and how to hybrid your workforce and some best practices for return to the office. And finally, members of the Vistage community should save the date for an exclusive interview with General Colin Powell on leadership learnings that he's had through his storied career. And that recording will be released on July 16th. So mark your calendar to be able to listen to that exclusive interview for our Vistage members. So thank you once again, ladies. Take care and stay safe, everyone.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.